Welcome back to statistics. When thinking about a multivariate study, be it an observational study or an experiment, we often have good reason to think a priori that one or more of the variables may have an influence on other variables in the study. So, for instance, I may have in a study on nutrition, for instance, I may have a belief that the amount of salt intake in a person's diet would have an influence on the person's blood pressure. So we want to be able to distinguish between those kind of variables that influence other variables, which are going to be called independent variables, and variables that are influenced by other variables, which we'll call dependent variables. And in addition, there's often the case in the real world that there are variables and factors that you may not have thought of, that may not be under consideration directly, but that nevertheless influence the variables that you are considering in a study. And that can be troublesome in a statistical study. Those variables are called confounding variables, and we'd like to have a way of thinking about them and of handling them in a statistical study. So this short video is about these ideas. And again, I want to go back to the slides that I had discussed earlier and pick up with those, and then we'll look at some examples. So the idea of independent and dependent variables tracks with this idea of certain things influencing others. An independent variable, which is also called an explanatory variable or sometimes a predictor variable, is one that we expect to influence other variables. While a dependent variable, which is sometimes called a response variable, is a variable that is influenced by other variables. So the little diagram there just shows you a basic sort of conceptual picture of an independent variable that's influencing the dependent variable, and the influence is represented by this arrow. It has to be acknowledged, though, that in many cases the situation is more complex. Both variables may, in fact, influence each other, as you can see in this diagram here, where the influence goes both ways. In cases like these, the distinction between independent and dependent variables may not apply. And an example here that would come to mind is from economics. In fact, economics has a wealth of examples like this. For instance, if you look at stock prices and bond prices, they influence each other and often in opposite directions. So when stock prices go up, yields on, for instance, municipal bonds often go down. But it's not clear whether one is causing changes in the other or vice versa, or maybe they're both being driven by changes sort of in the underlying economy that may be hard to put your finger on. So the situation can be quite a bit more complex than either just the simple situation of the previous slide, where we have an independent variable influencing a dependent variable, or a situation like this where two variables are influencing each other, or an even more complex situation where there's a host of variables and maybe all of them are influencing each other. But still, this distinction is going to be useful for us, so I wanted to make it. Now, to get at sort of the more complex situations, you can have a situation in which you have an independent variable that you think may be influencing some other variable here, and but there may be a variable outside the scope of what you're studying that's actually influencing both. And so that kind of variable is called a confounding variable. Now, the situation here can be very complex. And sort of the simple example I think I've discussed before of shoe size and reading ability illustrates this. It is true, excuse me, it is true that there's a relationship between shoe size and reading ability in the population of first to seventh graders. But that's not a causal relationship. And in fact, there's a confounding variable here. The confounding variable is precisely age, right? And age is playing the role here of influencing both shoe size and reading ability. And it's making it look like, to a casual observer, that there may be a causal relationship. Maybe shoe size does influence reading ability. But that's actually not the case, as we know. It's just the simple fact that the kids are maturing, and they're getting, as they get older, they're both growing physically, and their reading ability is getting better. Now, excuse me again, in a lot of situations, confounding variables aren't as easy to spot as in this simple situation, and that's why they're a real problem in studies, both observational studies and statistics. When you can't distinguish between the effects of two or more variables on a response variable, then you say that those two variables are confounded. And so, if if you weren't sure whether it was whether it was age or shoe size that was actually causing the changes in reading ability, you might say that those two variables were confounded. Notice that true independent variables and dependent variables themselves can't be confounding variables, because a confounding variable is by definition something that's outside the scope of your study. So if you've identified the independent and dependent variables and you're looking for confounding variables, they're not going to be among your independent or dependent variables. Those things are confounding variables are by definition outside the scope of your study. So there'll be other variables that you haven't thought of yet. One of the great advantages of experiments over observational studies is that well-designed experiments can eliminate the effects of confounding and establish real cause and effect relationships. I have to emphasize that this is the case even if the experiment doesn't explicitly identify all possible confounding variables, which can be an impossible task because there's like an infinite number of things that could be influencing your study. So an experiment doesn't have to identify the possible confounding variables. The design of the experiment itself is designed so that any possible confounding variable is sort of neutralized by the design of the experiment. So let's take a look at some examples now. Now we're in 2.1c and d of our text. And I wanted to look at just a couple of quick examples here. Let's see, what was it? Oh, yeah, this one. Can your brain predict political preferences? This is kind of an interesting study. We'll take a minute to look over it. In 2011, a study done by cognitive neuroscientists found that differences in political views may be related to differences in brain structure, as indicated by survey results for the political views and MRI scans for brain structure. Their findings suggested that in a convenience sample of university students, more liberal political preferences were associated with the part of the brain associated with monitoring uncertainty and handling conflicting information. In contrast, subjects with more conservative political preferences tended to have larger areas of the brain known to be related to the processing of memory and emotions. So you want to replicate the study in a different age group to see if you can obtain similar results. Notice this was done, the subjects in this study were done on a convenience sample of university students, so college age students. So, to measure political orientation level, you plan to examine 60 research subjects aged 30 to 50 with a survey instrument that results in a political orientation score using a 5-point scale where 1 means very liberal and 5 means very conservative. Then you'll use an MRI scan to determine brain structure for each participant. You're interested in knowing if political orientation, which is easily measured by the survey, can be used to predict brain structure, which is difficult and expensive to assess. So, what are the independent and dependent variables for this study? So, let's think about that for a second. The you want to notice. Let's go back to this paragraph. You want to know if you can use political orientation to predict brain structure. So that would mean that the political orientation, as identified by the survey instrument, is going to be used as the independent variable, and you're going to see if you can use it to predict the response variable, which is brain structure. So the independent variable here would be political preference as measured by the survey, and the dependent variable would be brain structure as measured by the MRI. I just want to point out that this example is from a whole field of study, a fascinating field that relates political preferences and feelings to not only physiological variables like brain structure, but also to psychological preferences that people have. And actually, there's an individual I would call out as sort of one of the leading lights in this field. His name is Jonathan Haidt. He is a social psychologist who's done some fascinating work on the relationship between people's sort of preferences and moral orientations and their political points of view. And Professor Haidt actually started out at UVA. He was a professor at UVA for a good number of years. He's since moved to the New York University Stern School of Business, but he has a number of books out on the subject, and of course he's a research scientist as well. And so his work here is cited by almost any survey that looks at this kind of question, which is how do people's political views align with other aspects of their psychology or physiology. So it's a really fascinating area of research. Let me do one more example, and this would be from 2.1D about confounding variables. Let's see, what did I want to look at? Oh, okay, here's one. This is this is a little bit of a kind of a simple example, but it's worth looking at. It's been found that there are relationships between crime activity, crime statistics, and a host of other variables. Everything from phases of the moon to, in this particular example, ice cream sales. So let's take a look. There's a relationship that as the murder rate increases, so does the sale of ice cream. Does this imply that eating ice cream causes people to commit more murders? What is a possible confounding variable that would produce such unrealistic results? So let me just let you think about that for a minute. Maybe you pause the video and scratch down a couple of ideas, and then start the video again, and we'll put our heads together. So, assuming you've had a minute to think about it, what'd you come up with? I think this is a little bit like the shoe size and reading ability example. It's a little bit simplistic and kind of easy to spot, but it's nevertheless useful, I think, because it gets you thinking about these ideas. What a confounding variable would be something that would be related both to ice cream sales and to murder rates. What would be something that would cause an increase both in ice cream sales and in murder rates? Well, you might be inclined to think about climate or weather variables like temperature, for instance. Uh, higher temperatures in the summer obviously make ice cream a more attractive product to a lot of people. And it's also a known fact that in the summer months, crime of all sorts increases, partly because people are just out and about more in the summer months. And so there's more opportunities for criminal events to happen. And so, one possible confounding variable here would just be temperature, right? The hotter the temperature, the more likely it is that people will buy ice cream. And it's also the case that the hotter the temperature, the more likely it is that we're in the summer months, and we know that crimes tend to increase in those months for a number of reasons. So, temperature would be one possible confounding variable here. Let's take a look at the ebook and see what it says. Uh, they first ask us to look at the independent and dependent variables. So we're trying to see whether ice cream sales really cause more murders. So ice cream sales are the purported independent variable, and murder would be the dependent variable. But that seems a bit unrealistic, and they do, in fact, identify temperature as a confounding variable and give for reasons similar to the ones that I gave. So there could be other confounding variables here too, and you might have thought of some. And just because it wasn't the one we identified doesn't mean it was necessarily wrong. That's the thing about confounding variables. There can be a whole bunch of potentially confounding variables, and it kind of highlights the importance of having statistical methods that can, in some sense, neutralize the effect of confounding variables. And when we talk about experiments in a little more detail, we'll see how that happens. All right. Thanks for listening, and good luck on the homework, and we'll be back at you soon.